Back to the adventures of the monk and the monarch. Slight delay last week, or last month. We had to delay it for various reasons. But as usual, there's me, the monarch, and my co-host, our local tabletop connoisseur, and the man of 1,001 holds, Mildra the monk. Look, I just saw that in my feed recently. That was like my favorite thing Jericho ever did.
Hold 1. Arm drag. Hold 2. Arm bar. Hold 3. The Ottawa flapjack. Hold 4. Arm bar.
But yes. We're not going to be talking like specifically about any of the Lodoss War shows, though. More, we're talking about the overall impact that this franchise has had.
I think the easiest place to start is the fact that for a lot of people, they're mostly going to know Record of Lodoss War if they are familiar with it through the original anime, which was good for its time, but that anime does have one bad habit that a lot of stuff from the 80s and 90s does: cell reuse.
Now, are you talking the original OVA run or the?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The 26 episode anime is a little bit better at that. The original OVA was one of those cases of notorious cell reuse.
Yeah.
Now, is it the biggest offender of cell reuse? No, that honor still goes to the original Sailor Moon. But it's one of those things that you just have to deal with when you're dealing with older anime.
Now,
you're gonna have a lot of shortcuts.
One thing I do want to note is it's gonna sound like a bit of an odd comparison at first. Like, I'm not gonna compare like the shows themselves, but in a way, this is a bit like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure in that most people, I don't think, realized how much influence this show actually had overall. In the case of JoJo's, it wasn't until the OVAs actually got a US release in the late 90s, early 2000s, where you kind of got a small group of people that started to figure it out, but it'd been around since 1987 when I think JoJo's actually started. We completely missed so much of the actual influences that had. But in the case of JoJo's, it got that surge of popularity with the anime. More people started looking into it. The same is kind of true of Lodoss, but here in the West, I don't think it really ever had that later JoJo's momentum. So I think a lot of people are still kind of in the dark on how much this show actually mattered.
Yeah, and I did have to give people a bit of a education when the game Deedlit and Wonder Labyrinth came out, which we'll get to that a little bit later. It is important to note that its earliest form was in the form of the novels. But that's not exactly true because its earliest incarnation was in what's known as replays. I've talked about this a bit on my channel, but replays were a thing that was very popular in Japan. It was essentially doing a text retelling of a TTRPG campaign, essentially a magazine version of actual play podcasts. Lodoss was one of these. It was a D&D replay that was in a tabletop magazine in Japan called Comptique, which was a mix of computer and boutique because Japanese wordplay. The title was D&D Magazine Live Record of Lodoss War Replay.
I know it used D&D, but the setting was a non-rule specific setting that was made.
As time would go on, it would be integrated into the world of Forcellia for Sword World, specifically 1.0 Sword World. The reason I have to say 1.0 is because each edition of Sword World that's gone on has kind of focused on a different region. I'd liken it to how you have a different region each generation in Pokemon. 1.0 was Forcellia. 2.0 is Raxia. And 2.5 is Alfram. As time has gone on, Lodoss became far more integrated with the world of Forcellia.
I am hoping one day we might actually get that Sword World stuff as a more proper release stateside. I know we've got the fan translation of all the works, which
not all of them.
Not all. Yeah, not all of them. But I do like that there's people invested enough to be doing all that. I know it's
I
come up
mean,
on quite a few of our other streams, but Sword World is a much bigger deal over in like I believe that's the biggest over there for tabletop.
as far as homegrown, yes. I've seen a lot of people refer to Sword World as Japanese D&D, and with 1.0, saying that is kind of a stretch. I think it's been stated that it has more in common with RuneQuest than anything else. But the key thing to note is, since it was built upon that replay, there are a lot of familiar elements that you might see in a D&D campaign, especially one in the 80s.
Yeah, I've been rewatching the original OVA. Like I've not watched that since way back in like from VHS tapes. We were watching it between playing D&D sessions. I
So
think that's
I'm
kind
going.
of where most people got into this because it is very clearly a tabletop inspired thing with mix of elves, dwarf. It sounds
Mhm.
like player banter between the characters.
Yeah,
That
though.
OVA knew its audience.
Yeah, and this is where it's important to note that, and I realize this might be a shock to some people who got into D&D later, but in the early days, if you picked elf or dwarf, that was both your race and your class. A practice that's largely fallen by the wayside, but it certainly was there. I think part of the reason it fell by the wayside is because people were pissy about how OP elves were back then.
Yeah, and then later they just like try to okay, you can pick any class, but you might be limited on your levels, which I thought was always a weird choice. I think most people just kind of ignored that.
I For my own experience, I've taken the approach that that whole level adjustment thing was a bad way to do balance. I can see why John Wick thinks game balance isn't necessary for an RPG. I just vastly disagree with him on the approach.
I'm of the matter as long as all of the classes like they feel useful and not just completely redundant.
Hmm.
I think that's kind of where you need to end it because you're never going to perfectly balance everything.
You're not in. There is the mindset that balance somehow equals the same, but obviously those replays were eventually remade into the original series of novels by Ryo Mizuno, which it's only been in the last few months that I've found people translating them. For the longest time, it was in my. I knew that the novels existed, but I figured that that it's one of those things we wouldn't get. That said, I wouldn't mind an official translation by like Yen Press or something. The original there was the original set of novels. Then there was a prequel set of novels called Legend of Lodoss, and then that would spin off into Next Generation, as well as Legend of Crystania, which the original books would get an OVA adaptation we've talked about before, which I believe that OVA was like 6 episodes
12 or
and
13, I
12,
think.
which is that's quite a bit for
Yeah.
OVAs, especially around that time.
Yeah, this is definitely an outlier among the OVAs because it's basically an
Mhm.
entire series. It just never got released on TV, as far as I know.
Yeah,
Well, I guess it might have been. They were TV length episodes.
and of course, even more, and the story is even continuing. That more in most recent times, there was the Crown of the Covenant series, which started in 2019. Oh,
Now, here's the question: is this a rights nightmare dealing with Lodoss, or do they actually have like who owns the rights? This shit sorted out.
oh,
Because this sounds like a nightmare.
I think I don't think it's a rights issue per se. I think the issue is that Katakawa, like a lot of Japanese companies, is very skittish about bringing stuff stateside, especially stuff like novels, when in their mind that hasn't been proven as viable. What is kind of amusing is that Mizuno created the Lodoss setting when he was still in high school.
And
Oh,
was he part of the original replays?
yeah, the
Okay.
original replays were baby.
That probably
Um, he
helps
was the, he
simplify
was
the
the D
issues.
he was the DM for the original sessions. Now, Lodoss is described despite being an island, it's described as being the size of Australia, which technically makes it a continent. Mizuno had also further drawn manga that took place on Lodoss. Apparently, his big inspiration was Frank Frazetta, which, and I should note, there is one novel that did get translated into an official release, and that was The Grey Witch back in 2017. But Seven Seas, who did it, had stated that they don't have any plans to do the further ones. They said about 3 years ago that they'd love to do more if it sells enough copies, which basically trying to pull the Capcom test.
But yeah, by and large, though, for most anime fans like here in the West, it kind of seemed to have, like, the history of Lodoss kind of seemed to have stopped at that original OVA for the longest time.
Mm-hmm. And because of the fact that it's built around a setting, there's a lot more material that's present, including a lot of stuff before and after the events of that. Well, you know how with some anime adaptations of manga, you're essentially getting just one arc of the manga and that's it. We kind of had that here, and I know we had a more extended anime, and then Legend of Crystania, which is a pseudo sequel. But the thing is that those are still their own beast.
And then you got something like Louis the Rune Knight, which I don't think most people even realized was at all connected to Lodoss.
Nobody knew that it was until a few years ago. It doesn't exactly help that if you go into Rune Soldier blind, there's no way you would have known.
Yeah. I think that's the part of this world where they just decided to put all of the silly shit. Like the rest of this land is everyone in Lodoss or whatever the third continent was. I forget what it was called.
Yeah.
It's like we don't talk about that place.
It does still count. It was still the light novel was still written by Ryo Mizuno, and of course the novel was covered in a few episodes of the anime and a few volumes of the manga. The light novel that went for 10 volumes. And then it would get 2 more follow-ups. The last one came out in 2012.
So yeah, this is like decades of content never came over. So yeah, it's easy to see why no one had any idea how important all of it.
Yeah.
But it is interesting though, looking back, like once you've seen Lodoss and looked up some of the stuff, again, it's kind of like JoJo's, where you'll look back over all this anime you've been watching, and you're like, oh, I'm starting to see where some of this inspiration started coming from.
And obviously both Deedlit and Pirates ended up becoming the mascots of the series. But even beyond that, I wouldn't be surprised if you ask anybody who had done a fantasy manga in the last 30 years if Lodoss was an influence, because in a roundabout way, I suppose it did introduce the high fantasy concept to a wide audience.
I mean, having again gone through the first few episodes of the OVA recently, I'm even seeing like hints of this as something as recent as Goblin Slayer.
Yeah, and Goblin Slayer also had its basis in a D&D campaign, and I'd also bring up Slayers when it comes to this concept. Slayers started out as a replay, then was redone as a manga, and then was done as an anime.
It's weird, this thing, like, most of us had no idea what was going on at the time. So important, the replays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do remember, I've mentioned this before, but cast your mind to when a lot of people looked at the Goblin Slayer TRPG and were like, why didn't this use D&D? And yes, I'm aware that the Adventurers Guild application is just a D&D 5e character sheet in the light novel. I am well aware of that. However, something that I think a lot of people do not take into account is that the tabletop scene in Japan is not what people think it is. If anything, I find it far more diverse than the stateside one, where everybody thinks 2 games are the only games that exist. Is it more niche? Oh, definitely. But within that niche, there's a significant amount of variety, which for the longest time was really hard to get any English translation of. That's starting to be significantly easier, and I have to thank companies like Lion Wing for helping push that. But this is why it's important to note that Sword World is the bigger one, because um, some people I know have nicknamed the Goblin Slayer TRPG Sword World 1.75, because it feels more like Forcella than it does Raxia, which, given the style of fantasy and Goblin Slayer, makes sense. And I suppose to a certain extent, I can even put in some of the fantasy isekais within that sphere of influence. I realize that might be a little bit of a stretch, but in the broad strokes is what I'm referring to.
Oh yeah. Like honestly, I think I'd probably take about 80% of the fantasy type anime I've seen have probably taken something from Lodoss. I
Hmm.
wouldn't be surprised if the number was that high.
And with especially especially since I know a lot of people I know a lot of people might look at the style of fantasy that it's going with, and say that that is no different from anyone's D&D campaign. I don't think that's entirely the case, because, well, just look at Puritas. Like, even though she's referred to as a dark elf, she does not behave in any way like the typical drow do. And I could go into a conversation about the setting but not setting thing that D&D has, but this is a case of somebody going completely on their own, because, well, there wasn't exactly a whole lot of things that you were expected to do when all you have is just, say, Beckme or the rules cyclopedia. Now, some people say that's a good thing, that because of that you can interpret it how you want, but a lot of times people don't go as far as Mizuno did. Like, they'll just use the assumed pastiche, and that's it, which helps something like this stand out. Even and I would say Lodoss is what you tell people your D&D campaigns were like. Rune Soldier is what they were actually like.
I've had my fair share of rune soldiery moments.
Hmm.
Far more
Uh,
than I've had Lodoss moments.
yeah, and the big reason why Rune Soldier has the Sword World connection, it largely begins and ends with the fact that it takes place on Aelcrast, which is north of Lodoss.
Now,
And
one
of
thing I'm
course,
trying to remember though, how many of the video games other than D have actually gotten released out of Japan?
there was a Record of Lodoss War game on the Dreamcast that was released. The advent of Cardis, though we didn't know it at the time. A lot of people dismiss that one because they just see it as a Diablo wannabe. But if all you had was a console, and you didn't have the game, didn't have Diablo on PC, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
I mean, the setting does lend itself fairly well to a Diablo style game. So it was a good
Yeah.
choice to go with if you were going to pick a genre.
Hmm. The and Loda that game was developed by Neverland and published stateside by Crave. Remember them? Um, it came out in 2000, and I say Diablo like, but it would have more in common with Diablo 1 than 2, especially since you're not picking a class, for instance, which in that regard, especially because of how it's so rooted in equipment, I'm sure that somebody could easily argue that it would have more in common with the with stuff like Souls likes and dungeon crawlers.
Yeah, that said, I don't know if Lodoss ever like I know there was a decent number of video games. I don't think it ever really had that much of an impact in that area as it did for your tabletop and anime.
Well, there was one game on the Game Boy Color. It had one on the Sega CD or Mega Drive CD, depending on where you are. Though the CD game is more or less a retelling of the OVA from 1990, because it was the style at the time. Um, there was a sequel game on the PC Engine, which was was compatible with the Super CD-ROM 2, which is basically the equivalent of the TurboGrafx CD. And well, who the hell had a TurboGrafx 16 in North America, let alone anything further than that?
I swear I knew at least one person who owned one. They never talked about it much.
The now the I should note that the longer anime, the one that was 27 episodes, that has the full title of Chronicles of the Heroic Knight. That one is well, it's following the third and fourth novels, and the Lodoss War 2 PC Engine game is kind of in that vein. The Grey Witch got a video game adaptation that was on the MSX2, as well as Windows 95. But who the hell did you know that had an MSX?
I don't even remember what that one is.
That was the PC Engine console that Konami made. The main reason I know about it is because that was where the first two Metal Gear games were put out on. And even though the original Metal Gear was on the NES, that's considered the inferior version.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame we didn't really see much in terms of big video games out of the Lodoss franchise. 'Cause I think the potential was there.
Mm-hmm.
Because D&D had so many games that were actually rather good. So there were a lot of bad ones. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, it's all over the place.
Yeah. But with something like a more defined setting like Lodoss has, I think it could have done a lot with that. It just never seemed to happen, other than the occasional blips here and there. I do hear D-Lit was actually a really good game on Steam right now.
That is, and that's partly because of the fact that Team Ladybug already had established themselves previously. The game they did just before this, which was also in the same subgenre, was Toho Luna Nights.
Oh, I didn't know they made that one too. That one was good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same studio that did it. And there's also the fact that Ryo Mizuno was supervising, and I think that's the reason why the series has been able to maintain itself in some form or another. Is much like how we're able to enjoy a good live action when it comes to One Piece because Oda is hands on with everything involving it.
I will say, I haven't watched it yet. I've seen some clips, and I still don't think it's gonna be that great, just because I don't think One Piece translates to live action. But it is a lot better than I would have expected it to turn out. So, kudos.
Yeah, and with this, obviously the key to making this kind of thing work is having him involved. I don't know how involved Mizuno was with a lot of the other video games. I can't imagine all that much.
Out of curiosity, how well did the deal?
It did decent, and there was a tease at the end to Lyle, who's the protagonist from Crown of the Covenant.
It's nice to know even here in the West, Lodoss is still seeing some degree of success when something does come out.
Mm-hmm. And it is kind of amusing that obviously the Castlevania influence is there, but also Ikaruga, which makes this the second time I've dealt with a Metroidvania that is drawing from Ikaruga. The first one was Outland, which is also really good. veterans when it comes to weeb shit, there's been a certain degree of appreciation for for this particular approach. And when I look more into the world that Lodoss kind of built, it's very clear to me that with the space that Rio was given, he decided to actually build a full on world instead of building a pastiche for his players. You know, spending a lot of time over the years building building lore and the like.
That takes some dedication, because that is not a small time thing to do.
Yeah, of course. I do not know how much. I do not know if any of the characters within it are directly or indirectly based on the characters from the original campaigns. It's possible that it's possible that some of them may have been, or there may have been some creative editing once it crossed into the threshold of being a novel.
Oh, there is definitely a good degree of creative editing at that point. People don't generally make characters under the assumption they're going to be part of a greater novel.
But well, that's definitely the case, and
but I'm sure that's still based largely on what they played in the game.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that wasn't just thrown out entirely. Again, that's just kind of guessing and speculation. It's really hard to know unless you've sat through the original plays.
Yeah. And well, I'd say one of the real big cases of him not trying to just use what's considered the more common tropes of D&D into it is how he treated dragons. Specifically, I'm not going to go into the full thing, but the chromatic dragons are built around guarding certain treasures that they were forced to guard by an ancient emperor. There's also, I mean, granted, none of them are what you would consider nice, but that kind of thing alone is going to be different from how they're normally used, as well as the fact that I'll just use Deedless as an example. It's talked about how elves have access to shamanistic magic, which early D&D there wasn't really the closest equivalent to that was clerics, and even that's a stretch.
Yeah.
But I suppose one particular point of influence is consider how in a lot of games you have spirits of wind named Sylph, you have spirits of water named Undine and the like. That's a recurring thing you see in a lot of different games. Legend of Mana is the one that immediately comes to mind,
yeah.
And that's the reason why I say that this is something that has that level of influence. It's not a direct influence. It's not something that people have done callbacks to the point where it becomes a game of whack-a-mole like JoJo has been, but it is definitely present.
So, do still also have a lot of your classic fantasy tropes who show up. Like, Lodoss is not responsible for the dwarfs versus elves fights, but they're there.
I'd say the way Lodoss treats them, it's more of a rivalry than anything else.
Yeah.
It isn't like some settings where the two absolutely hate each other.
Yeah, I love the interaction so far between him and Deedlit.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't get as overblown as it does in, say, the Two Lords movies, but it's there. I do like how he tease the dwarf, like how he'll actually talk up the elf when she's not there.
Mm-hmm. Like I said, rivalry. And just having Parn as a disgraced knight, not many people are going to do that. Are going to do that with their campaigns.
Well, son of a disgraced knight in the OVA.
Yeah, and of course, even with the story when it came to the OVA, it did make a few changes.
As you kind of expect.
Again, I know a lot of people watch adaptations like a hawk for any changes, but when you're dealing with adapting something from one medium to another, some changes are going to be inevitable because, like, if you're adapting a novel, you have to figure out, okay, how am I gonna put 200 plus pages of information into 90 minutes?
That's not happening. Stuff's getting trimmed. Things are going to have to get altered. We're going to have things like the transition from anime to live action with Rurouni Kenshin, where the spell of the only Wabon guy's fighting style got changed.
Because these kind of things are things that that you're going to have to adjust because it doesn't quite fit.
And to my knowledge, with the record of the Lodoss, it sounds like they managed to keep the spirit of it, regardless of what it's shown up in so far.
Well, it's worth noting that during the production, the novels were still in the process of being written. But the thing is that a lot of the adaptations really seem to focus on one particular story, that being the Demon Dragon of Fire Mountain, which I know I botched the name because the way, first off, that novel was split into two parts. Even with that, some aspects were skipped, though there was an audio drama that filled in the blanks, which obviously I'm not going to expect an audio drama to get translated anytime soon.
Yeah.
I will note this. I know some people would ask if Lodoss ended up influencing stuff like Berserk. No, the two big things that influenced that were Gwyn Saga and Rose of Versailles. So let me check when Gwyn Saga first came out, because that's a light novel series that also refuses to stop. Okay, Gwyn Saga technically came out first. That was all the way out in 1979. There have been a total of 147 novels and 26 side stories.
Also, I'm trying to think when Berserk manga started. Was it that long after Lodoss War?
Let's see, 89.
See, I believe Berserk didn't really grab much, if any at all, influence out of Lodoss.
But I would still credit Lodoss with exposing this sort of high fantasy to a wide audience in Japan.
Yeah.
I mean, Gwyn Saga certainly contributed, but that particular style of fantasy, I don't think is quite a one-to-one. Of course, there was also the Aslan series of light novels, but the audience for something like light novels versus an OVA or a manga are going to always be different. That's the reason why I put a lot of emphasis on that. I can't. There is one game series that I can't help but wonder took some inspiration, though. That being the Lunar games.
Oh, there's definitely some there. If the original creator of Lunar came out and said, "Oh no, it had nothing to do," no, I'm calling bullshit. It's like the Perfect Swan guy trying to say he didn't take inspiration from Perfect Blue. It's like, no.
Black Swan.
Black Swan.
Pretty much.
Like, I did say Lunar is definitely a bit of a lighter affair than Lodoss.
It certainly is, but I could see some vestiges.
Yeah. That said, it's a topic I wish we had a lot more info on, but because it's been so isolated in Japan compared to a lot of other things, this was not exactly the easiest topic to research and look at compared to some of our others.
But I will admit one of the other reasons why I could see there may be some vestigial aspect is you probably played the original Lunar, haven't you?
Technically the PlayStation version, but yeah.
Which is actually the better version.
People pretty much consider that the original point anyway. I don't think a lot of people will even remember about like the old Sega CD version. Was it Sega CD?
Yes, but consider the Dragon Master outfit that Alex had in the first game. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one comparison between him and Parn, but think you can
Oh,
see.
definitely. That said, I doubt the creator of Lunar would ever deny any inspiration from Lodoss. That seems to be a more an American Hollywood director thing.
Pretty much. Although, of course, the tricky thing when it comes to confirming this is getting development info when it comes to older games in Japan is very difficult.
I mean, I'm sure someone could just try asking him, but I don't even remember the creator of where they're even still really active or fucked off one day.
It was that was Game Arts and Studio Alex at the time. Um,
I mean, more of the actual. I don't know names.
I do know that some of the staff from Game Arts would assist in the development of Brawl. There also was but there also was a bit of stupidity because Studio Alex and Game Arts ended up suing each other over the span of a few years. um, mostly because of an adaptation of Magic School Lunar, which resulted in a copyright dispute. Studio Alex lost and went bankrupt.
So many different gaming related lawsuits. I just have no idea what's going on with half of them.
Join the
Copyright's
club.
annoying as shit to look into.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, that said, like, I think I've talked about, like, everything I've kind of been aware of and interested regarding Record of the Lodoss.
Hmm.
This is something I think you've had a bit more information than I have over time, so is there anything
Yeah.
we're missing here?
Um, I'd say the one thing that I will note, and maybe you'll put a link to this, is the fact that despite so much of the material being Japan exclusive, there have been a dedicated few who've been endeavoring to try and bring some of that back. And while the Lodoss novels are still not fully translated, um, the original Legend of Lodoss has been completely translated by these people. While Crown of the Covenant came out in 2019, and it had the fact that it had the number one and it implies a series, that there hasn't been any confirmation about that. I think this is a case much like City Hunter, where you think the series is finished, but it finds a way to come back.
Like, it may not have the largest fan base here in the West compared to other shows, but it's a pretty dedicated fan base. Like, people really like Lodoss for if they get into it.
Yeah, and hopefully with the novels, you're going to see more people get a bigger appreciation for it beyond just the the OVA or some of the anime.
Definitely. So I guess with all that out of the way, it's a good time to wrap this stream up. As usual, eventually this is going to end up on YouTube. It's going to be one of the shorter episodes, I think. But yeah, you can catch both me and Mildra Thursday next week. We're going to keep talking about a steampunk tabletop RPG. Wow, I was just looking at the PDF. I don't know how that name escaped me.
Brass and Steel.
I was about to say Steam and Steel. Like, that's not right. Yeah, I guess then we will see you back here with adventures next month, last Saturday. Mm-hmm. We haven't picked a topic for that one quite yet.
We'll have something figured out.
Oh yeah, plenty of time.
But until then, stay frosty, everybody.